Despondency, Shaucha, and Satya. Despondency is another manifestation of motivation working incorrectly. But unlike envy, which whispers, "If you had, you would be happy," despondency says, "Even if you do something or get it, it won't bring you joy, so you don't even have to try." And if envy is mostly scrolling through pictures of a hypothetical future, then despondency is mostly complaining about pictures of the past. Despondency is a desire turned inside out, a desire born in an attempt to avoid repeating negative experiences. Up to a certain point, we are all full of enthusiasm and respond with joy to everything that life offers us. But then something happens, and despondency becomes our cruel companion. A series of failures, the loss of a loved one, disappointment in dreams, chronic stress, or even the realization of a discrepancy between ideal and reality can serve as an initial impetus. At first, a person may experience only mild sadness or fatigue, but if these conditions do not find resolution, they begin to take root. Under the influence of negative events or thoughts, the brain begins to work differently. The positive aspects of life are devalued, and the negative are exaggerated. In parallel, physiological changes occur. Prolonged depression affects the functioning of neurotransmitters in the brain, such as dopamine, responsible for motivation and pleasure, and serotonin, which regulates mood. A decrease in their level leads to a feeling of hopelessness and lack of energy. These same substances directly affect appetite, food choice, physical activity level, and overall energy metabolism. For example, low dopamine leads to a lack of motivation to move, and an imbalance of serotonin can provoke cravings for carbohydrates or loss of appetite. These behavioral changes directly affect calorie balance, the production of leptin and ghrelin, the so-called hunger hormones, insulin sensitivity, and overall metabolic efficiency, which in turn further exacerbates despondency. There are thoughts about their own inability and the hopelessness of the situation, the belief that nothing will change for the better, or I will never cope. It's as if the inner critic has gained full control, constantly whispering about the futility of any effort. A person begins to see the world through the prism of his inner depression, and each new failure only confirms his distorted picture of the world. Gradually, these negative thoughts drain your emotional resources. Joy disappears, apathy, indifference, and chronic fatigue take its place. What used to be fun loses all meaning. At this stage, laziness often becomes not the cause, but the consequence of despondency. A person simply does not see the point in actions. He does not have enough energy and inner strength for initiative. A decrease in activity leads to a decrease in positive reinforcement from the outside, closing the vicious circle. Eventually, a person finds himself in a state of learned helplessness when, after repeated unsuccessful attempts to influence a situation or get out of it, he stops even trying, convinced of the futility of any effort. Despondency becomes not just a state, but a deeply ingrained behavioral and mental strategy, which is extremely difficult to get out of. The methods used to accumulate tapas could help here, but attempts to pull yourself together or force yourself to do something based on pure will are doomed in advance to utter failure. Failure is equivalent to trying to make yourself laugh when you want to cry. Volitional efforts, by their very nature, require significant energy expenditure. Will is our internal resource that allows us to overcome obstacles, resist temptations, and act contrary to our immediate desires. But despondency is characterized precisely by the depletion of this resource. A person who is in deep despondency is like a car with an empty tank, which is required to go uphill. You can't make it move just by pushing harder on the gas pedal. Despondency often signals emotional, psychological, or even physical exhaustion. and trying to fight it with the help of dwindling willpower only exacerbates this exhaustion. Moreover, such a struggle creates a vicious circle. When volitional efforts do not bring the desired result, and they cannot bring it in the absence of internal resources, a person begins to experience feelings of guilt, shame, and their own inferiority. I'm not strong enough. I can't even handle this. Such thoughts only deepen despondency, turning it into hopelessness and self-flagellation. Therefore, to begin with, it is worth focusing on actions, the result of which becomes noticeable quickly enough, as well as the result of neglecting these actions.
The principle of Shaucha, or purity, outlined in yogic philosophy as one of the niyamas, implies in its basic understanding concern for the physical purity of the body and the surrounding space. When a person is depressed, often even these simple actions, take a shower, clean the room, wash the dishes, seem overwhelming. However, unlike grandiose acts of will, these small steps do not require enormous efforts, but give tangible results. A sense of accomplishment gives a sense of control. A person begins to feel that his actions can be effective. These first, often unconscious steps help to overcome the inertia of despondency, because even minimal physical activity associated with maintaining cleanliness promotes the release of endorphins, which improves mood and reduces the level of stress hormones, such as cortisol. A person begins to gradually get out of the illusion of his own helplessness, repeatedly becoming convinced that he creates internal resistance to proactive actions himself. These habits are transferred to other areas of life, contributing to more orderly and purposeful behavior, and cleanliness increases self-esteem and self-confidence, which manifests itself in more open communication, readiness for new challenges, and a reduction in avoidant behavior. Getting used to the state of cleanliness, a person himself can no longer afford to return to previous states. Unpleasant odors or dirt around him become unacceptable, which further helps to get rid of habits such as procrastination and unhealthy perfectionism. When, under the guise of striving for perfection, a person sets himself difficult to achieve standards in advance and easily gives up after a couple of attempts to reach them with a rush. However, these habits take root very deeply. Of course, you can't get rid of them by keeping them clean, although this is one of the best ways to get off the ground. You have to move in small steps. The results in the short term are not so noticeable as to give some impressive motivation, but the obsessive muttering in the style of, "I can't, I don't want to, it's better later," does not go away for a long time. Moreover, it cannot be said that this is some kind of unambiguous evil. It is often an interpretation of the state of the body by the psyche, when there is really little strength and energy, and it would be better to take care of yourself. But the problem here lies in how accurate this interpretation is. If you really don't have the strength to get up at all, lie down and do nothing. Make it clear to yourself that you are not capable of action right now, and give yourself up to doing nothing completely. If at the same time you don't chase thoughts in your head, you will have a great meditative practice. If you feel it's time to act, get up. If you don't have the energy to go to the gym, it doesn't mean that you can't walk. By taking regular promenades, you will find that you want to increase your distance, and gradually you will have a desire to engage in other activities. But all this will happen only if you are truly honest with yourself. On the one hand, it is absolutely not worth being overzealous, exposing your health, including your mental health, to even a small risk. On the other hand, if you don't regularly and steadily complete your daily tasks, you will never be able to get out of the swamp of despondency so easily. External circumstances that you can't really influence are not that depressing, and you probably don't care much about your inability to fly or move objects with your mind, because no one can do that, and no matter how much you try, it wouldn't work anyway. But those moments in life where you could have done something, but you didn't do it yourself, really upset you. The most painful thing is where you can theoretically take a proactive action, but for some reason you don't. It should be understood that overcoming laziness is always a pain, both physical and emotional. The reluctance to train the body is largely tied to the sensations in the muscles during and after training. It really causes discomfort, especially without proper habit. Unwillingness to create and achieve certain goals is associated with previously received emotional wounds, various bitterness and resentment. It is necessary to distinguish very clearly between the moments associated with the need to overcome this discomfort and the real pain, after feeling which you need to stop. But in order to be able to distinguish between them, you need to be extremely honest with yourself, and such honesty is simply impossible if you are used to being constantly dishonest with others. In our world, almost everyone has formed the habit of being dishonest in one way or another. It just so happens that our culture is permeated with the praise of such qualities as cunning and the ability to various tricks, ambiguity, and veiled statements. These qualities are considered signs of high intelligence and are often not condemned, even when used for outright lies and deception. For example, in cinema and literature, it is usually called cunning when the hero is deceived, and meanness when the hero is deceived. Although from the point of view of yoga, both and any untruthfulness in general are a violation of the principle of Sathya. The word Satya is derived from the Sanskrit root sat, truth, and means following the truth and abstaining from untruth. Now, you may well think that this is extremely difficult and practically impossible in the modern world. But before convincing you otherwise, I want to draw your attention to the key point of this principle. The point is not that if you suddenly tell a lie, you will definitely be punished for it, during your lifetime or after. Of course, the point is that the truth should be spoken through you in a natural way. This will relieve you of additional stress on a number of areas of the brain that ensure the success of lying and control internal reactions. For example, to lie, the brain must first gain access to the truth and then actively suppress it. And this is not just ignoring. It is the process of actively inhibiting a dominant, truthful response, which involves the anterior cingulate gyrus, which monitors conflicts and errors, as well as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, responsible for working memory and cognitive control. Also, lying, especially socially significant lies, causes an emotional response, fear of exposure, guilt, and shame, which causes the hormonal system to idle, and this is a very inefficient waste of resources. Lying is much more difficult than telling the truth. The brain needs to keep the truth in active memory, construct a lie, monitor its consistency, remember who was told what, and suppress body signals that may give out. The intensity of the cognitive effort behind this process is enormous. Of course, the point here is not only how much glucose the brain needs to maintain a high level of energy consumption, getting used to lying, the mind partially loses the ability to objectively perceive itself and reality in general. This powerful tool, which strives to optimize everything and everyone, repeatedly begins to deceive itself. It begins to build explanations to reduce any discomfort and justify its own laziness. Getting used to these excuses, he begins to ignore the discrepancies between words about himself and his own results. But this disregard leads to increased anxiety and depression about the accumulated consequences. This is deep despondency, and it is simply impossible to get out of it by continuing to deceive yourself. On the other hand, the habit of talking honestly, first of all, to yourself, starts a chain of positive changes. It reduces internal distortions and draws attention to the real causes of passivity, gives clear feedback from other people, and creates energy for small things. You begin to notice and accurately name the problem, translating vague excuses into specific obstacles. For example, I don't know where to start, or I'm very tired after work. An honest assessment gives realistic tasks. You are clearly aware of where you are lazy, where you are tired, and where you are afraid of failure. Over time, inner honesty becomes a habit. You learn to see real limitations and deal with them productively, resting when necessary, and not bothering with silly thoughts about your own failure or threat in the future, and working when there is a resource, without spending time thinking about how to cheat and push everything on someone. The other one, even if they are small, the results will appear very quickly, and this effectiveness will inevitably increase your self-esteem. Very soon, you will also start noticing when others are lying. This will happen inevitably. The brain, getting used to the correct patterns in its own work, will begin to notice deviations in the behavior of the interlocutor. So you absolutely should not be afraid of dishonesty towards you, to which you will not respond in kind. Communication will begin to be built according to completely new, clean rules. But in order to easily tell the truth, it is still necessary to practice adherence to other principles of yama and niyama. These are the deeper aspects of Shaucha, maintaining purity of thought and speech, as well as the principles of ahimsa, brahmacharya, and asteya discussed earlier. After all, when you have nothing much to hide, telling the truth is not difficult for you, and your word acquires impressive weight. The connection between Sathya and other yamas is bidirectional. When you get used to telling the truth, you begin to realize that you don't really want to violate the previous principles, because a constant sense of your own rightness is much more interesting than indulging in momentary weaknesses. In addition, you will quickly notice that others will begin to lose the desire to ask you uncomfortable questions, because they will feel that you can easily admit your mistakes, and for them to do this in response will be a real punishment. But most importantly, you will get used to not lying to yourself and get rid of the constant feeling of cognitive dissonance that arises from the discrepancy between your actions and values. You won't have to make excuses to yourself for the words you said, and your growing self-esteem will give you strength where you never expected to find it, and despondency will become only a fading memory.